Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ted Archer, and I look after small business initiatives from global philanthropy within the JPMorgan Chase Foundation. And for us, what that means is we have a series of programs, initiatives, and areas of investment that we look to make philanthropically that support the expansion of small businesses and business ownership globally. Our charge within global philanthropy is to really focus on areas that can expand access to underserved entrepreneurs, but it's also marshaling all the resources that a big money center like JPMorgan Chase can provide. You should know that what you'll hear from us today largely addresses the theme of the conference, which is research, which is evidence, actions and activities that can really propel small businesses to overcome some of the barriers that exist, specifically women-owned businesses and businesses owned by people of color. And that I'm mostly window dressing, and that Chris Wheat, who will introduce himself in just a minute, has a tremendous treasure trove of information and expertise that he brings to the table to advance our work, particularly in the United States. So before turning it over to Chris, I would just add a couple of bits of color for the work that we're involved in. So as you know, at a large institution like Chase, we're no strangers to just the idea that many of the barriers that exist for small businesses are things that we could have exacerbated, right? Or maybe even still do. But what that also does for us is provides an opportunity to be a part of that solution. And so a lot of the evidence base that's needed to address some of the unmet needs in the market start with partners, right here at the Cook Center. So Gwen and Sandy and the entire team have provided us this chance to partner to look at, as you heard this morning, some of the things that we often assume but don't know enough about as it relates to the conditions for success around small business ownership. What are some of the things that we know around starts and exits? And so Dr. Shapiro from Brandeis offered some of his remarks as well. But it's in understanding the evidence that's at hand that gives us what we need to formulate some of the solutions that can expand a wider opportunity for small businesses. One of the ways that we do that is through programs, research Chris will talk about in a minute, but it's also through some of the core work that we have at the firm. So while I and my colleague Kate Costa look after a budget, right, where we can work with partners and allocate capital, we also have core initiatives within our business that pay specific attention to what groups face. And one such initiative is called Advancing Black Pathways. Initially, we had a third colleague who was going to join us and talk about what Advancing Black Pathways means for our firm. But in short, for us, what it means is kind of threefold. One is it's us really naming what the issue is and who faces those issues. Advancing Black Pathways looks at three things. One is how do we find ways to advance careers, education, and wealth. And a few months ago, we spent some time in Durham right here with Sandy, Gwen, and team, inviting participants from here in the community in Durham to really provide us with some of the local knowledge, but also, as someone put it earlier today, raise some of the things that can hold us to account. Right? We want to be partners in the work to really unlock opportunities, and it needs to be credible and authentic. And I think that starts with being part of formulating what solutions are. So it's a newer initiative, right? Launched this year, but I think what we plan to work with partners across the U.S. on in key cities are ways that we can unlock opportunities for jobs and skills, ways in which we can look at how, as an employer, we can do better. Just this week, we announced a Second Chance initiative, looking at ways to really unlock what it means for individuals with criminal records to access career opportunities, even with a large firm. And then finally, it's in really advancing, wealth creation, understanding that the trajectory of demographics in the country, wealth transfer as it exists, and will continue to be exacerbated going from white families to more white families, frankly, and exacerbating the wealth gap. We know that there are urgent needs for us to really address. So that's a bit of a backdrop for, I think, some of the more interesting insights that you'll hear from Chris, but I also wanted to give you a flavor for some of the different things that we're marshaling at JPMorgan to address many of the things that have been raised today as a part of our discussion. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Chris, to talk about really two unique reports that marshal JPMorgan Chase data.
Thanks, Ted. So as Ted said, I'm Chris Wheat. I lead the what we call our local business and commerce research team at the JPMorgan Chase Institute. So as Ted was just framing up, there's at least three distinct ways, I think, that our firm try to enter into this conversation. One is kind of through philanthropic efforts. One is sort of directly through the business. And then about 5 years ago, in a somewhat more broad brush way, the senior leadership of the bank thought another way that we could make a conversation, enter the conversation around a variety of issues having to do with the U.S. economy, is to take the data that we have from our customers and clients, anonymize it, hire research teams to analyze that data and try to produce insights, data series, public-facing reports to kind of move the policy conversation around and at least make it a little bit more informed about what we actually saw in the data. And so that is what the JPMorgan Chase Institute does as a whole. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of what that means, so we now are a medium-sized team of about 40 people, and we do research on actually a relatively wide range of topics, all of which you might have some lens on as a large bank, right? So we have de-identified, anonymized customer data from people, right? If you have a personal checking account or personal credit card. We have business data for small businesses, and some international markets and trading data from our JPMorgan platform. And that allows us to do research across the 7 areas that you see here: income and household spending, mortgages, the mortgage market, but in particular, and the work that we focus on is on small businesses. It's sort of a piece of this bigger pie. One of the reasons I think this is particularly important for the questions that I've heard discussed this morning, and I suspect we will discuss for the next couple of days, is it is hard to get good, high-quality, granular data on small businesses. Many of you are small business owners. I suspect if I sent you a survey and said, would you please fill the survey out and get back to me, you'd be like, I totally value what you're trying to do, but I am busy, I'm trying to run my business. It is really, really hard to get data on small businesses because small business owners are busy people. And so having the unique opportunity to get this data from our client base, which is relatively large, we have, call it 4 million small businesses that are clients in one way or another in the US, gives us an opportunity to see on a transaction-by-transaction level cash flows, balances, business starts and exits in a way that is very complementary, if nothing else, to the kind of data you might collect through surveys. And so I've been very blessed to be able to lead a team to analyze this kind of data. Mostly just to illustrate the kinds of things that we can do with the data. I think there were some reports here before, and apparently we ran out, so we're going to try to get some more if anybody's interested in the next couple of days. Just to review a couple of top-level findings from 2 of the reports that we more recently did. Over the last 2 years, we've really been driving down to understand what we can distinctively say about small business cash flows and small business financial performance from the lens that we have. And so this is broadly speaking, a universe of about 1 million businesses. Some folks this morning talked about non-employer businesses, the ones that are mostly the owner of the business and not a lot of employees. That is a typical business banking customer that that's in our data set. So these are checking and savings account, business checking account customers for the most part. Some of them have employees, but we think these are mostly micro businesses. In that universe, we've been trying to understand a lot of things about their financial outcomes, one of which is a question about cash liquidity, like how much cash do you really have to keep running your operations? And the overall answer to that question is not much. Most of the businesses, independent of the race or gender of the owner, tend to work on a pretty thin cash buffer of less than a month, a couple of 2 to 3 weeks or something like that. We got very interested in the question of, well, how does that change on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis, in particular, given how much difference you might see from one zip code to the next in terms of wealth in that neighborhood or educational attainment in that neighborhood, or in particular for this conversation, racial composition. So this is kind of the first time we've tried to answer a question looking at things that are related to race and small business outcomes. Among other things, one of the things that you see is even at this relatively low threshold of having a certain amount of liquidity, 21 days is not a lot. It is sort of a lot for a small business. In majority white communities, meaningful shares have more than 2 or 3 weeks. This was the orange and blue bars on the top. Like the majority of the majority white communities, you see that's kind of what you see. In majority Hispanic communities and majority black communities, very, very thin cash buffers, right? Like overwhelmingly less than 2 weeks, and some less than that. So there's lots of communities where the small businesses are really working on a much thinner buffer to withstand any sort of unexpected expense, or sort of like if a payment is late, it's the exposure to running out of cash for one reason or another is quite a bit higher there. So we looked at a bunch of things in this report, but this was just sort of one to illustrate. Prior to that, we had done another report where we had an opportunity to leverage what we knew about the individual business owner's gender. So this isn't like sort of the community characteristics, it's the actual characteristic of the business owner. And again, it's hard to answer questions like this and try to like initially quantify this. But this report looked at both gender and age differences here. What I'm focusing on here is gender differences. Directionally, maybe not super surprising, although one of the slides I saw from earlier at lunch made me sort of want to understand what the differences are between the sample. In our data, at least amongst this population of largely micro businesses, non-employer businesses, in the first couple of years anyway, we saw that women-owned businesses had smaller revenues and lower growth. Also, by a segmentation that we did from these data, you could see that they were less likely to have large amounts of external finance, so $400,000 a year or more, kind of the VC style, although we don't know for sure whether or not this is money coming from a personal account or otherwise. But just as likely to be the kind of business that doesn't have inflows of finance from an external party, but actually growing a lot, so that over the first 3 years, 4 years, we're seeing that like 20% year-over-year growth that is often characteristic of high-growth firms. So sort of an interesting thing there about sort of how are different kinds of businesses growing. Again, this is really intended more to illustrate the kinds of things we're doing and to tee up more of a conversation than anything else. But it's one of the ways that this particular private sector firm is trying to enter this conversation, and something to think about, I think, in terms of how private sector firms can try to play more of a role, both in research, but also in kind of moving the conversation forward.
So Chris, one of the things you raised, which harkens back to another data point that we saw earlier, is the importance in cash flow management. Mm-hmm. And 21 cash buffer days is probably longer than most individuals have to buffer against financial challenges. But what we've been able to do with some of the evidence coming out of the JPMorgan Chase Institute, as yet another kind of public-facing, public interest part of the firm, is take that evidence, key in on some of the cities in the study, and then work collaboratively across some of our different partnership networks to introduce new interventions. Many of the interventions are pilot demonstrations, but they do show promise as it relates to ways to address financial health, ways to address cash management needs that small businesses have. that they can't get from institutions at the larger level. One of those programs is called the Entrepreneurs of Color Fund. It's an initiative that we've partnered with a number of other banks and foundations on in the city of Detroit, and now 4 other cities, which look specifically at ways that entrepreneurs who are looking to access capital anywhere between $5,000 and $500,000 can get the assistance that's needed before and after a transaction. And particularly to help with what most small businesses need, which is support along a journey, not necessarily looking for capital as the objective, but capital as an on-ramp to grow your business, to get to the next stage. That's a programmatic sort of outcome to using research. What are some of the ways that you've looked to influence policy makers? Your role sits in Washington, D.C. I mean, you obviously have access to a number of decision makers on Capitol Hill. How have you looked to leverage the research to engage those folks?
Right. I mean, I think, you see me choosing my words here. When we have engaged with policymakers, and it's the folks in DC, but it's also, as you know, as well as anybody else, it's also more local decision makers, inside and outside of government. A lot of those decision makers and policymakers just don't have data on some of these questions. And so like a couple of data points, sometimes it's helpful for shaping or framing a conversation. So if you are having a conversation about moving the small business sector, and you're talking about small businesses that, you know, have 50 employees or so, and you're having a conversation there, and it's like, you know, just as a reminder, and you don't need our data to know this, quite frankly, the census data would have told you this, but when you're talking about small business owners, most of them are much smaller than that, is a kind of thing that can be helpful kind of for reframing the conversation. Shining a light on cash liquidity as opposed to sort of, as one of many forms of liquidity, right? You can get liquidity through having a line of credit, which is distinct, but like just introducing a couple of new concepts for people to think about is probably where we are right now. Sort of pushing data and evidence into particularly the federal conversation probably always was hard. That's going to be the end of my sentence. It's not any easier now than it was at some prior point.
Yeah. So we may have time. I see Dr. McCoy looking to raise his hand, but do we have time, Gwen? Is Gwen in here? Okay.
Oh, down there.
So while...
Questions? Who raised their hand? Oh, back there.
Oh, sorry. It's a long way.
So when you talk about the difficulty of pushing data into the federal conversation, this is advocacy, right? Whereas arts organizations have things like Americans for the Arts, can you talk about what advocacy avenues are available that you know of? And if they're rare, which I suspect they are, what might the contours of that become so we can address this effectively?
That's a great question. So I wouldn't, if I were going to call what we do advocacy, I would probably need to like segment that a little bit. So there's advocacy, which is like, we think you decision makers should do the following thing. And because I work for an institution that has advocacy per se, it's important to sort of, you know, JPMorgan Chase would like you to make the following law is a thing that we hire people to do like most large firms, right? It's just part of the real world, right? What we do, I think, is try to introduce ideas and facts. So if what you wanted to do was this, well, here's some information that might be helpful to know when you make that decision, I think is where we, as the Institute, sort of parse that line. And I think that is kind of an advocacy. I don't want to sort of like not call it that, because we are advocating for using more data to make decisions. You also asked where those opportunities are. That is a great question, and I mean, I honestly, if you can always sort of do the cold call, but I would be lying if it probably makes a difference that we sort of come with the brand of a large firm with us. And then we've taken some time to try to build a reputation as an institution that's generating sort of fact-based insights. But if I were to like sort of break off and try to do this by myself, I think I would start to understand how much of that was like Chris Weed is a smart guy, and like Chris Weed has like an organization behind them. And so I think it is a really hard question to figure out sort of how to make those inroads.
So could I offer just a little bit of nuance in that the Institute, right, as you mentioned, is not an advocacy shop per se. We do have those at our firm. But I also think what you've been able to do, Chris, is invite advocacy into the conversation for how you perform outreach for the data that is collected, and then how you shape the agenda going forward. And so you guys do either quarterly or monthly outreach and roundtables with a number of national organizations, some of which are advocacy organizations. For example, the Association of Enterprise Opportunity and others that represent interests of micro enterprise and small businesses.
We see them as our audience, right?
Yes, right, as the audience, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And the other thing that I should mention, because we announced it this week, is that our colleagues at the firm, we have colleagues at the firm that have recently stood up a policy center, which is unique for us. It's the first time that we've done it, and the core issues that we'll be tackling are focused on jobs and skills and second chance hiring, with small business as sort of a important but sort of next phase portion of our work.
Hi, my name is Talib Graves-Mans. I'm an entrepreneur in the Raleigh-Durham ecosystem. I've been working here for the past 5 years, primarily focused on building my ventures, but also doing work in the community around advancing education for small business owners. And to be 100% blunt with you, there's not a lot of capital on the street right now for direct investments as well as technical assistance. And I've seen JPMorgan show up and Advancing Black Pathways that came to our event at Black Wall Street, and I know you all had a meeting here. So it's like the third or fourth time you guys are in our neighborhood. So I want to know if you guys have any conversations about putting some capital on the street within the 919.
Yes, and as you know, our company is over 100 years old, and there are places that we've been for a long time, and there are new places that we're kind of coming into our own, and I think the 919 is a brand new place for the firm. So I think a lot of what's happening now is the approach of having real conversations to figure out what, if any, is the right place for us to invest. And I think there are going to be a number of those. I've been doing work in the Raleigh-Durham area for a couple of years now in my seat, and I've gotten a chance to work with Sandy and Gwen and team to look at some of the national focus, but I think locally there is an opportunity to go deeper, and that's my expectation. So I would just invite you to continue to work with us, with our team, to find out what those opportunities are. And frankly, I think one of the most credible things that can be done is for us to ask, right, what's needed here? How do we actually partner in a way that's effective, that's not bringing New York or San Francisco solutions to Raleigh-Durham, sorry.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing this data and everything that you have been doing as a women entrepreneur. I'm with Chase, so thank you for your support. But at the same time, I would like to ask, we have seen a lot of data today, painful data of the reality of where race and gender converge. So what is JPMorgan Chase is doing in terms of having fair practices when providing loans or supporting the minority business entrepreneurs. And if you are scaling that to other branches or areas on the banking industry.
Excellent question. And I will admit that we could probably talk a long time about that. I think what we will hopefully be in a position to, in our short time, share with you today is some of the ways we think that we should be and could be addressing some of the unmet needs in the market. And that starts with us first, and how we partner with community lenders, how we partner with organizations that can fill some of those unmet needs of the market. So I don't think it's any one thing, but I've been in a position to sort of see how, whether it's data or programs or some of the core things that we do as a firm when entering a new market can be solutions for some of the unmet needs.
Just one way to think about, this is mostly the stuff that Ted is doing, so I can talk about it. And you should tell me if I got this right, but the way I think about it is it's the firm is like experimenting with things that are either in kind of the firm's view of its product space or maybe not, right? So with foundation dollars, you can do a program that is like, oh, I don't know whether or not the firm would actually sort of build this as a product, but you could fund something. And it starts to at least explore the space of ways that you could provide, for instance, capital to a wider set of businesses than the bank otherwise would have done without that experimentation, exploration. And then I have seen lots of questions live about sort of like, okay, we tried this program, like, how could that be rolled into sort of what the profit-making part of the business is doing, and like, is this going to work or is it not? So, I mean, it gives me at least some level of confidence that that the work that the foundation is doing in terms of experimenting with programs is not completely, separate hand from sort of how the business is thinking about it. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. So we're in the sort of privileged position to be public interest within a large institution. And so our charge is to both identify what's needed and helpful in the market as it relates to removing barriers for small businesses, but it's also, marshaling and influencing internally, what happens. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to do that. But our perception is that it's not, we're a big part of what a solution could be, but we're not the only part of the solution. And we've seen a tremendous amount of good examples across the country where, there's a spark that could lead to something effective.
Good evening. My name is Betty Murchison, and I'm a business consultant, and I work with public-private partnerships around social justice issues. And I heard you, Mr. Archer, I believe, mention that you have a second chance initiative. I'd love to hear more about that and how that can be accessed, because as you know, a lot of people are coming out of prison and they have a really difficult job making a decent earning. They can get fast food jobs, but that's not enough to live on or to rent a place to live. So we're trying to help them, working with inmates to entrepreneurs, a program geared toward creating entrepreneurship for people who have criminal records. But while they will provide the training, we need help with startup capital to buy tools, if you're a carpenter or a mechanic, things like that. So is this something your initiative will help with?
So I have more questions for you than I probably have answers, but that's a great initiative. It sounds like not only is the timing good, but it's certainly in line with what our focus area is with the launch of our new policy center. Is that here in Durham?
The Inmates to Entrepreneur, it's across North Carolina.
Okay.
Based in Raleigh.
Great, okay. So I have lots of views related to barriers, regulatory and otherwise supports for small businesses operated by formerly incarcerated and individuals with criminal records. Lots of barriers on the kind of state, local regulatory front. If you want to open a barbershop, for example, there are lots of barriers for you and it's absurd, or if you're a beautician, et cetera. there's a lot that I think we can sort of support as it relates to navigation, help understanding what some of the key opportunities are, realistic opportunities are that could lead to scale. So I'd love to continue a conversation with you just on that piece. And we could point to some of our partnerships in Texas and in New York with programs that support this segment of small business owner.
Hi, I'm LaShawn Banks, and I'm here from Harvard, where I run a program where we deal with the mayors and chiefs of staffs and chief data officers and public officials from the top 40 cities across the country. And pretty much we help them influence policy to close this wealth gap. I'm here because Durham is my home and I actually live here and commute. But my question is a little bit for you, Chris. Especially when talking with folks that create this data and they get it in front of policymakers, stories can be spent so many different ways. And when we hear growth, there's such a tremendous difference between revenue growth and profit growth and employee growth, and especially when we're talking about minority businesses. So I'm just curious, do you really separate out what this true growth means? Because it may be different in different communities, which can affect access to capital. So just wondering, how do you take this type of approach when we're talking about the growth that really we need as minority businesses or women-owned businesses?
Right. No, that's a great question. And we have taken some pains to try to be clear about those different dimensions, in particular revenue growth versus jobs growth. Maybe revenue growth and profit growth versus jobs growth. And one of the reasons it was important to our team to do that was because so many businesses don't have employees and aren't going to have an employee, and that's like fine by way of that business owner. Like, they don't have an intention of growing past that, but it's still like 20 million households. In some sense, my opinion is that that ability to positively influence the lives of households, black or otherwise, quite frankly, has been overlooked in part because like there wasn't really great data. But, like, a lot of the data sources presume that you were an employer business, and I think that that's in some sense like the way we kind of like jobs are important. They are super important, but they get talked about a lot in this conversation, and it's a little bit taken for granted, like why it is that we're talking about that to begin with. It may just be because that's the data that we had. So that's like one of the things that, by way of introducing new ideas for people to think about, is like, are you concerned about taking a family that had a business that was making like $50,000 a year and transforming that into a family that's making like $300,000 a year? Like that's like if you could do that for 10 million families, like that might actually be a kind of growth that we care about that's like not always in this conversation, and it's one of the things we've been trying to draw attention to. So I don't know if that's responsive to, yeah. Okay.
Any other questions? We're gonna take one more question because we're really running tight on time. So one other question. Who's the lucky person? Okay.
My question is geared toward, I know you're going to have all these small caveats, but when JPMorgan Chase decides to send into a city, you have already a company that's been around forever, so you know what your focuses are. You know what you want to put money into and what you want to be the signature of contribution to what you've done and impact. So what are your focuses? Because, I mean, whether it's in tech ed, which would be great, or any other concentrations, what are you all's top 5, or say that when you go into the city, and what are you trying to impact?
Really good question, and I apologize for not framing my earlier response better. So Chris and I represent a small business focus area for our kind of corporate responsibility work. But our charge is largely inclusive economic growth. I mean, it's the idea that there are multiple levers to economic inclusion. The other 3 areas are workforce, jobs and skills, for example, financial health, and then neighborhood revitalization, which is for us primarily affordable housing. So within those 4 areas are places that we would look to invest dollars, time, energy, the expertise of colleagues who have spent a career working on these issues, and then ultimately capital and the things that money centers can bring. So I think, I hope that answers the question, but I think those are big tent areas, but to enter into any market, and I think what we've learned from our work in places like Detroit is that there's no one size fits all, that we shouldn't assume that this is work that we should be doing or could do alone. And it's good to have big vision, but take manageable steps along the way to address some of the larger intractable problems. So that's why, to your earlier question, sir, we've had like 4 conversations that are kind of public on the public end. And I think it's on purpose because we want to make sure that we're focused and intentional, that we've carved out what we think a problem is with you, then are bringing the necessary resources to actually do something about it.
Wonderful. Let's give our guests a round of applause.
So I just wanted to say thanks again, and also to acknowledge all the other researchers that we've worked with hand in glove, whether it's Asset Funders Network, FHN. There's so much work that we have yet to do in conjunction with so many great partners. So thank you. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
All right.